Recording is started.
Here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Please keep those mics muted if you have I think it's not even allowing you to undo them, but just as a reminder, keep those mics muted for us until we allow for them. We've got quite a few attendees for today's webinar, so we'll give everybody another couple of minutes. I'll get started here when we hit 1 past the hour on my computer, so another 30 seconds or so, and we'll get started. All right, welcome everyone. We may have people filtering in here over the next few minutes. We had quite a few registered for this webinar, and we'll let everyone get the opportunity to come on in and get settled. I'm just going to get started here with a few announcements before we get going. Dana, could you push to the next slide for us? So first, my name is Lindsay Myers. I'm from Primal Pet Group, and I'll be introducing your speakers today. First, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar and for participation today in advance, as well as participation throughout the series. First job is to remind everyone that this webinar, like all of the ones prior and all of our PFI calls, is governed by our antitrust policy. We are here to discuss and learn about PFLM, Pet Food Label Modernization, and will not discuss topics favoring or disfavoring companies or categories in our market that include pricing, market share, or business agreements. If you feel at any time like we're getting into that antitrust territory, please bring it to my attention or to the attention of one of our moderators, which you can do there in the chat if mics are muted, and we'll help the conversation right away. Any questions about antitrust? All right, go ahead and push to our next slide. Today is the last of our series. Thanks again for all the attendance today and on our prior topics. Today we'll be focused on ingredient statements as well as handling and storage. If you missed any of the series or want to watch a recording of today's, those will all be available at petfoodinstitute.org/PFLM. You may have heard about other training sessions across industry, and just as a background, AFCO also has a series of webinars and some in-person and virtual attendance informational opportunities to learn more about PFLM and plans to continue both of those efforts. PFI supports and participates. Many of us here participate in those in the education and in attendance of them, and urge everyone to attend as much education on these topics as possible. Those trainings are often intended for a broad audience that includes regulators and often is heavy on regulators since they're the ones who are often participating in the creation. And so PFI wanted to just make sure that we had more specific training targeted to pet food makers and taught by industry members that focus on building the label rather than how to regulate once it's built. So we're really hoping to make that as approachable for you all as possible. Again, all the recordings and past webinars will be found at petfoodinstitute.org/PFLM. Go ahead to the next slide. Introduction of our speakers. So first, of course, myself, Lindsay Myers. I am from Primal Pet Group. I'm our Vice President of Quality, Nutrition, and Compliance. We also have Patrick Fulling today, who will be moderating our Q&A section towards the end. And our first presenter, Jerry May, is the Vice President of Government and Trade Affairs for Freshpet. And then we also have Kim Spinelli, who is the Manager of Regulatory Affairs for Post-Consumer Brands. So welcome, everyone, and we will push to our next slide. Today's agenda. So last comment before I turn it over. If you have been here for our prior sessions, you know that we will have time towards the end for Q&A with the speakers live. And so please be patient. We will get to as many of the questions as we can while mics are muted and while the presentation is going. You are welcome to type your questions in the chat. We will be moderating that. And again, we really encourage all all questions. There are no silly or stupid questions. We really want to make this interactive and functional for all of you here. If you would rather ask something verbally, just wait until the end and we will have the opportunity for you to unmic and ask a question verbally instead. So with all that said, let's move on to our first presenter and first topic with Jerry Maid from FreshPet. You're still on mute, Jerry.
So many things to remember. I sound better on mute though. So thank you. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to speak about the ingredient statement and some of the changes that have taken place there. You'll find this in the AAFCO official publication under PF6. And the 2024 version of the AAFCO manual does have the PFLM rules and regulations in it. First of all, just broadly to remind everyone that from an ingredient statement standpoint, they still have to be in descending order. All ingredients have to be in the same font, size, and color, and the vitamins and minerals are declared in order of predominance by name, under vitamins and/or minerals. And we'll visit that a little bit more in a second. Everything in a pet food from an ingredient standpoint must be AAFCO defined, an approved food additive, or an approved color additive, or generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. And there's really two forms of GRAS. One is one that's submitted to FDA for a letter of no objection, and the other is a self-affirmed GRAS that you would do that would follow the same guidelines for GRAS, but in general, stick it in your desk drawer, and if you're asked to present it to the FDA, then you would go ahead and do that. One thing I do want to mention in this segment is if you're not aware of it, I think it was October 1st, the FDA ended their memorandum of understanding with the AAFCO Ingredient Definition Committee, and they've been working with AAFCO for several decades, almost as many decades as I am, but that's come to an end, and so the FDA will no longer be part of that ingredient definition committee at AAFCO. AAFCO's looking at other avenues to approach it, but FDA is going to have a couple of listening sessions in the next couple of months. They put in place something called AFIC, and that's the Animal Food Ingredient Consultation. So you can, if you have an ingredient that's fairly simple and a common food, if you would, then you can set up that with FDA. You can find that information on the FDA website. The other thing is on this common ingredients, there's not currently a list in the AAFCO manual, but if you go on the aafco.org website, you'll find a heading called Common Food Index. And if you go in there, you can find the list of the ingredients that are currently recognized as common foods. And there are things, I think there's 76, and I think maybe over 80 now, but they're foods like apples, pinto beans, carrots, red beets, snow peas, some different mushrooms, but all that's there. And also you'll find a submission sheet if you want to try to submit another ingredient to FDA. You can do, I'm sorry, to AAFCO, you can do that. So I just wanted to point that out so that we're all on the same table, on the same page from that. Next slide, please. So we're covering the vitamins and minerals. This is really not a new, I guess, a new statement, but what it is clarifying how you will list your vitamins and minerals, and it also codifies the usage of the vitamin and minerals, whether it's these the common name or the scientific name, but that's codified into the official publication now from APCO. So just a few highlights on this. Choline chloride, which you will see right after natural flavors, is not in the premix anymore. If you'll look down to where you see mixed tocopherols and citric acids there at the end of the ingredient statement, those have to be separated or they would be considered a common ingredient and not allowed. So you must have that mixed tocopherols or preservatives and parentheticals, and then citric acids are also a preservative in parentheses. So again, the vitamins and minerals are not different, but there are some requirements for which comes first, the scientific or the common name, and so we will cover that in the next slide. So if you're going to list the common name and the scientific name, the parentheticals are still allowed. I guess the difference is that common name has to come first. You can't put the scientific name first, and that is something that AFCO will enforce. But if you want to just have the common name, you can do that. But again, if you choose to have both, put that common name first. And I think that is the main points on that. So just as a recap, if you're going to have the vitamins by common and scientific, common name first. Make sure that you've got your parentheticals and that's been codified. That you're not using a mixed. I shouldn't say that, a collective term by saying mixed tocopherols and citric acid. You have to make them separate. And I believe that is about it. So pretty much still, comfortable for all of us. Just some things codified, and this mixed, the new AFIC, and that's that animal food ingredient consultation opportunity that's available to companies, and then that common ingredient list, as I said, you'll find it on afco.org. So next slide, and I think I'm kicking it over to.
I think you're back to me.
Hey, thank you, Lindsay.
Go ahead and push to the next slide for me, Dana. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to go over a few clarifications related to specific ingredients and groups of ingredients. This first one here is pretty minor, but this is an update that we have a full list for poultry now published. So in the past, we had this list of acceptable meat types within the meat category. So if you were listing meat on your ingredient deck, that could be any single ingredient or a combination thereof of cattle, swine, sheep, or goats.
Hey, Lindsay.
Yeah,
I saw a message. I'm sorry. I saw a message that people were not able to see the slide. I'm seeing it, but I don't know if that was just one individual or whether anybody.
We know we have a technical issue with Teams.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
People logged out, logged back in, and they've been able to get it. We don't know what's going on with Teams.
There's several folks.
Thank you,
Jerry. It's probably important at this point with how many people who have pinged in the chat. If you are having a problem seeing the slides, they are here and they are on the recorded version because all of us who are presenters can see them, and many of the attendees can see the slides, and several attendees who were not able to see the slides once they logged out and back in were able to see them. So if you're having an issue, I would recommend logging out and back and then back in, or if you're using the browser version of Teams, trying the application and vice versa. I have been able to see the slides on both. I tested both while people were having problems in the chat, and they are both working. So I'm not gaslighting you. I promise Teams does these crazy things to me too. But please try logging out and back in if you're struggling. And otherwise, we'll try to explain slides as best as we can, and they will be visible on the recording after the webinar. So deepest apologies. Meat. So in the past, we had a list of species that could be used if you were declaring meat on the label as a generic term, that it could be cattle, swine, sheep, or goats, or a combination of those meats within that definition. And then for the first time with this new update to the OP, we now have a similar list for poultry. So if you wanted to claim poultry on your ingredient deck, that could be a combination of chicken, turkey, duck, geese, guineas, ratites, which are ostrich, squab, or any combination of those species. Something I'd like to clarify here is that if you have another meat that is not included in these lists, for example, if you had sheep and swine and goat and you cleared that as meat, but you also had deer meat, you would have to list that separately. So in that case, you would say meat, comma, venison. Deer must be listed as venison. And the same thing goes for the poultry. If you had a combination of poultry items, chicken, turkey, and duck, for example, but you also had quail or pheasant, you would need to list those ones not included here separately. So you would say poultry, which could include multiple species within this list, and then you would have to list quail or pheasant after that. So any item that is not included in these groupings cannot be used within these, but can be declared separately on your ingredient deck. Next slide, please. Next clarification is that we have never had a list of fish acceptable in the same way. So you could have fish listed on your ingredient deck, and that could be a combination of things. And that was discovered to be a bit of a gap. And so we've been having discussions on how to address this gap. And after a very recent meeting last week, we have some confirmation that we will have fish separate, which is going to be a combination of what we are calling for now fin fish. And we're still discussing the specifics within that list. But then we have moved forward to a vote on shellfish and alligator. So alligator would be listed separate, and then shellfish, which includes, I have a list here for shellfish. Currently that list is looking to include mollusks, clams, oysters, squid, shrimp, and lobster. And again, the list for fin fish is still in the works. Right now, the recommendation is to use, if you're questioning this and you're unsure, is to use the FDA seafood list. And if one of my co-presenters wouldn't mind popping that link into the chat for folks, I think that might be helpful. But there is an FDA seafood list that's searchable right on the FDA's website that you can use. That if you don't have experience with that list, I just want to call out a few important things to note, which is that as you're searching through that list, there will be several columns. One column is for the acceptable market name, and the other is for the common name. Now, it has been said on several occasions that either the acceptable market name or the common name are acceptable to use on an ingredient deck. But I will say from personal experience and experience of my colleagues, if you can use the acceptable market name listed there, I've found that you will probably have less issues on a state-to-state basis with acceptance of that. There are many cases where consumers and market pressures are looking towards the use of the common name instead. I pulled a couple of good examples of that. And so one is green mussels, right? So New Zealand green mussel is the common name, but the acceptable market name is mussel, just plain mussel. And so obviously if you're using and sourcing New Zealand green mussels and that's what you are putting in the bag, you have a spec sheet that determines that, you are welcome to use New Zealand green mussel. But you will also note that on that FDA seafood list, there is a vernacular column that is not acceptable for use. And those names are often very similar and confusing. So in this green-lipped mussel case, you've got mussel, which is the acceptable market name, always going to be approved. You've got the common name, which is New Zealand green mussel. And then in that vernacular column is green-lipped mussel, which is often frequently used in market and in advertising, but would not be acceptable on your ingredient deck. So definitely utilize that seafood list. Carolyn's put a link in the chat. And if there's questions about that after the webinar, we can certainly address them. But again, just as a recap, acceptable market name, that one is pretty straightforward. You can use the common name if needed, but there can be some complexity there. So look to the vernacular column to make sure that you're avoiding any of the vernacular terms that will most certainly be not acceptable, at least by some of the states. Next slide, please. Last clarification item is sugar. So when you're listing sugar, which is a common food in your ingredient deck, that's referring to sucrose, which is often sugar cane or sugar beet sugar. And that's referring, of course, to the disaccharide sucrose, right? So you're just going to list sugar, and that's referring to that disaccharide, which you may have to show proof of with some sort of specification sheet. However, when you're looking at sugar on the guaranteed analysis portion of the updated PFLM labels, that's sugars more in the plural term. So that's looking for the total sugars, right, which will be mono and disaccharides. That is critically important, of course, because if you're listing sugar in your GA, that is a maximum value. So you'd want to make sure that you're listing all of the sugars there. Whereas when you're listing sugar on an ingredient deck, you're literally listing the ingredient that you're adding, again, in that order of ingredients by weight. Next slide, please. Organic. So done with clarifications, and we're just going to chat about a couple of updates for organic. There's no major update here. It's really, again, more of a clarification. There's no big changes. We still must follow the NOP or the USDA National Organic Program if you're including the word organic in your ingredient deck. Then you must have that backup on file, right? So if you're saying organic brown rice, like in the example that's on the screen, you must have the backup to prove that the material that you are adding into your diets is the organic version. This actually has nothing to do with if you're going to put organic on your primary display panel, you're having to get it certified and you're doing that. This is completely unrelated to that. This is if you have an organic ingredient in your formula and you want to label that in the ingredient deck portion, you can put that in the ingredient deck, just as listed here, organic brown rice, and then that would indicate that all the other ingredients in this deck are not organic. Now, the other way to display this, which you have to have the same backup for, can you switch to the next slide for me, Dana, is to use an asterisk. So in this case, you would just say brown rice, asterisk, and then at the end of your ingredient deck, you would say organic. Now, in this example, it seems like, why would I do that? I'll tell you that if you have multiple ingredients that are organic in your ingredient deck, and maybe you're dealing with one of those smaller labels or your marketing team is having trouble getting all of these to fit, you can add an asterisk next to all of the ingredients that are organic, and then just have the footnote asterisk organic at the bottom, and that would indicate that any item in the ingredient deck that has an asterisk is organic. And again, as a reminder, if you do that, any ingredient that has that asterisk, you will need to provide backup paperwork if a regulator reaches out to prove that that follows the USDA NOP program. I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Kim, to go over handling and storage.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kim Spinelli, and I am from Post Consumer Brands. And I'm here today to help in the understanding of the handling and storage instructions section for the Pet Food Label Mod. Next slide. Oh, you're there. Never mind. So on this slide, let's get started with the handling and storage section, which first you'll find in AFCO in the OP under regulation PF12. And then let's identify what is the handling and storage and how is it to be used. So first, I just want to remind everybody that this is a voluntary attribute. It is not required on your labeling. However, if you choose to use the handling and storage instructions on your labels, you need to follow the guidelines, which differ from a large label to a small label. Your small label is considered anything that is under 40 square inches. And when using a small label, you are not required to use a header that states the handling and storage instructions. However, on a large label, you are required to use that header. One thing I want to call out also is that when you decide to use the handling and storage instruction on your labeling, per AFCO, this must be separate from any other mandatory attributes. So for instance, you can't have it, it can't be contiguous under feeding guidelines or your calorie content. It must be clearly separated from that information. Next slide. So this is an example of a large label and two good examples of handling and storage icons that are approved through PFLM. Again, AFCO has deemed specific icons as approved icons, and they must be let me go back. I'm sorry. So your header must be bolded because this is a large package. So you must have the handling and storage instruction header in bold on the back of your label. It must be clear for the consumer to read. And again, it must be one of the approved icons. Next slide. So on this slide, I wanted to provide a comprehensive view of the approved icons. And later in the presentation, I will show you where I provided a link where you can gain access to these. So when you're using any of these icons, again, you must use the header. I can't say that enough if you're using a large package. And again, these are the only approved icons that can be used. On large packaging, you don't necessarily have to use, the image. You can also choose to use just the text. But if you choose to use just the text, you also have to still make certain that you have your handling and storage instruction header on that label. These icons are in both color and black and white, and you can choose whether or not you want to use whichever one. And again, for a small label that is less than 40 square inches, you have to use the approved verbiage that is under the actual icon. Next slide, please. So basically, on this slide, what I would like to call out is that first, your image needs to be conspicuous. The consumer needs to be able to read what it is we're conveying to the consumer. The icon must be measured per the size of your label, and we all know that there's requirements around the size of your label and then the size of your text. And in the box, I have here an example of your panel size, and then of course your graphic size in inches. And when you're using an actual icon and verbiage, your measurement is from the top of that image to the bottom of that image. So I just want to call that out so you're aware that that's the full image. So that's your size. Also, I wanted to call out that I've added here the link from AFCO where you can find these approved icons for your labeling. They're high resolution. Next slide, please. So are we lagging or, okay. So the last slide, this is just an example of what a small label would look like. So maybe a wet can that's maybe a 5.5 ounce. And this is a good example of, here's all your information, in your label. And then you get down to the bottom and you have here, store unused portion in refrigerator. So this is where you would have your, you would add your handling and storage instructions, just the verbiage, and you're not required to have a header because your label space is less than 40 square inches. And I think that pretty much covers the handling and storage. Patrick?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So this concludes the 5th and final webinar covering all of the PFLM changes. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So next, we wanted to share with you the details regarding the upcoming in-person training. PFI is hosting an in-person labeling laboratory that will kick off with lunch on Tuesday, February 18th, and will wrap up with lunch on Wednesday, February 19th in Dallas, Texas. On Tuesday, the plan is to bring your own labels, old, new, or both, and we will be working together in teams looking at how these regulations impact your own labels. Then on Wednesday, we will mix up teams to learn and focus more on how to develop new labels with these PFLM changes. The estimated cost is $675, and this includes your registration as well as your meals and supplies. Attendance is limited and registration is required in advance, so please register as soon as possible so PFI can plan accordingly. The link to register will be emailed out to everyone in today's webinar, and I think it was just dropped in, but it can also be found on PFI's website. And this brings us to completion of the 5 webinar series. Any questions? Seeing no questions, I believe that is it, Carolyn. Any additional comments?
No, and I apologize for the technology. I just put in the chat, it even likes for us. I only saw like 2 out of the last 4 slides. So
Oh,
it's
no.
not sure what Teams is doing, but it is on the webinar. The recorded copy has all the slides. So if you're having issues, and we can also send you a copy of the slide deck if you'd like that, so you can see those. That's all, Patrick, for me.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.